about her also.
Yeah,
Very
just a
soon.
second.
Yeah.
Just a second. Um, Professor Shirin Kudchedkar was the former head of the Department of English, SNDT Women's University, and she retired as the director of Canadian Studies program at the university. She led the department almost since its very inception. She was instrumental in developing an exceptional curriculum, both in terms of depth and range, in consultation with experts around the country. Shirin Kudchedkar was a foreign expert at Nanjing Normal University for a year. She has taught a course on women's writing in India at the University of York, Toronto, and she has written and lectured on various topics with a particular focus on critical theory, feminist criticism, English language teaching, and Canadian literature. She was the Gujarati sectional editor for the two-volume publication Women Writing in India 600 BC to the Present, edited by Susi Taru and K. Lalita, in which she translated Gujarati pieces into English. She unearthed clearly feminist stories and poems by writers who were not commonly regarded as feminist. Dr. Kuchetkar edited two books, Violence Against Women, Women Against Violence, and Canadian Voices, an anthology of Canadian poetry. She has also edited Postmodernism and Feminism Canadian Context, and she has translated and edited Saroj Pathak, Whom Can I Tell? How Can I Explain? Her workbook on English language teaching continue to be on the syllabus of the university's undergraduate program. So I would now invite Dr. Meenakshi Shivaraman if she would like to say something about Dr. Kuchetkar.
Thank you, Drupadi, Mamta, and others of the SNDT University. I'll make my association with Dr. Kuchetkar very anecdotal because Dr. Dhole, we are waiting to listen to you. We're so happy that you are here to speak on this extremely important occasion. I was her student. I was fortunate enough to be her MPhil student of 3 students in that batch. So there were 3 of us in class. We used to have lectures on Tuesdays and Fridays. We were working at that time, we were teaching. And I remember on one Friday afternoon in her department, I think the 10th floor of the SNDT University, she got a whole consignment of books from Canada from one of her Canadian friends. She opened the box in front of us and there was this huge treasure of books and she was pulling them out. She took 2 of them with her home. I remember this so vividly, and I'm sharing this with all the young people who are listening to this talk and who have not met Shirin Kudchedkar. So she took those 2 books home, and for our next lecture on Tuesday, she summarized both those books as chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 of this book, and chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. She summarized the books that she finished reading during the weekend for our class. That is the level of her inspiration. That is the kind of a personality that she was, so dedicated and so committed. So I'd really appreciate the younger department over here that is holding on to that memory and having these memorial lectures. There's so much one can talk about her. Just one more anecdote, because I was very particular about my answers. We used to handwrite our answers. I was very particular about not having any errors, grammatical errors in my paper. And then she would look at it and put a comma here, a colon there. That is what I have learned from her, right? And so I'm going to hand this over back to the department. Thank you for letting me speak.
Dr. Dhole, please go ahead. We would like to listen to you now.
Yeah. Thank you, Drupadi. Thank you, Manisha ma'am. Thank you, Meenakshi ma'am. It is indeed a privilege for me and a great honor for me to deliver this Shirin Kudchedkar Memorial Lecture for this year. When I received this invitation from the department, I was also given the brief about Dr. Kudchedkar's work, and I was very impressed with her work and the kind of areas that she explored as an academician, as a teacher. So it is indeed really a great honor for me and privilege to speak on this topic in uh, in the memory of Professor Kuchetkar. So thank you, the English department of SNDT. Thank you, Drupadi ma'am. Thank you, Manisha ma'am. I hope I was told that last year or last to last year you had you know lots of eminent people there. I do not know whether I stand in that galaxy of experts who might have come and delivered the lecture, but I'll try my level best to speak on something which is not my actual really an academic area of expertise per se. I'm a media person. As you all know, I've worked as a journalist, and then now I'm working in the field of media as an academic area. So in that way, I'm not very genuinely a literature person. Of course, I'm interested in literature, and like most of the people, common people, I also have my own likes and dislikes and some understanding of literature as such. But it's almost like a novice reader or some common reader. Obviously, I am quite not familiar with many literary theories or the literary debates per se. So please pardon me if I do not touch upon some of those areas. My area of study and interest has been how technology shapes us and our ways of knowing and understanding and expressing, and of course, communication. And it is in that context I have been studying lots of experts, scholars in the field of media. There's just too much, of theorization, and a lot of very interesting ideas are increasingly being floated around with respect to technology and how it is shaping us. It's very difficult for me, obviously, to take an entire intense or depth review of all of them. And therefore, what I plan to do in this lecture is to take you through some of the contours of the digital world or the digital environment or the increasing digitization of our life that may have direct or indirect, but more structured, more deep influence on what we understand by literature or our experience of literature. So, my scope is pretty simple. I would be more or less, as I said, I'm not a literature person, surely not the English literature person. I do read English literature, but I have read it, but not as much as some of you have. Obviously, I read more of non-fiction than the fiction. Even within whatever literature in English that I have read, I've read more of non-fiction than the fiction. So what I plan to do, as I said, the scope of my lecture would be to take you through the broad contours of the sweeping but still very deep changes, which I think have also changed the literary domain. What I'm planning to share with you is are mostly conceptual probes rather than one singular theory as such. So, the entire lecture would be more of an extensive rather than extensive engagement with various issues of digital world than an intensive engagement with one or two or maybe few. So obviously, it could be said that it is more of a probe than any answer as such. Okay, so with this thing in background, I would proceed with the topic. The first question that I need to confront before I actually turn into the digital effect of digital era on literature. First, we need to clarify, we need to understand what do we mean by digital. Digital is not simply, I mean, obviously we know that there's so much of mobile and internet around us, there are so many social media, and every day we come across, getting bombarded with digital media and its output and so on. So obviously this it's a part of the digitization. Is it a part? It's a part of the larger digital world that we are living in. There's hardly any aspect of our life which has not been touched upon, which has not been getting shaped by the digital technology. But let's not get into those aspects at their face value. Let's look at what these digital value do to us structurally at more depth, at, at much more broader level, at a structural level. And I would quote Karl Marx in this way, in this regard. Uh, for example, Marx has said, and I quote, that the material facts of society determine the shape of its culture. I mean, we are all aware of Marxist work and how he emphasizes on the conditions of production, the material conditions of production, and access to those material conditions of productions. So the basic thesis is that cultures, civilization, society, politics, and of course economy is more shaped by the means of production and the access to the means of production. And therefore he says, and I quote, that the material facts of the society determines the shape of its culture, its art, its music, its philosophy, its religion, and of course its literature. So, and my point is that we are actually living in a time, particularly I would say in the last 30 odd years, more specifically 30 odd years, but broadly speaking, last 40, 50 years, we are going through some deeper changes in our material conditions. I will spell out what those material conditions are resulting into. But that's an important point that we could start with. So, if Marx had said, though, said this primarily from the perspective of political economy, we have in 1950s and 60s Marshall McLuhan perhaps echoing it in a different way in the realm of media, where he says medium is the message, where what he was trying to draw our attention at. In fact, interestingly, McLuhan, who is considered to be one of the greatest media theorists, one of the most important media theorists, whose relevance has been more. I mean, he is more relevant today than what he was during his lifetime. Okay, so his major academic contributions have come in the 50s and 60s, but I think he was far ahead of his times. Okay, and what he talked about, or what he envisaged, or what he realized, or what he foresaw coming, was far ahead of his time. And what we are actually living today is what he was talking about way back in the 50s and 60s. And perhaps that may be the reason why he was slightly misunderstood initially, and also partially slightly people were contemptuous. At least the academic word was slightly contemptuous about it. But let's not go into the academic response to Marshall McLuhan's ideas then. But what he said was quite important for us in this connection. What he was asking, or what he was arguing, is that it is not what is contained within the medium, what we call it as the message, that is of fundamental importance. He says it is the environment that the medium constructs for a message that is far more vital, that is far more effective in shaping human conditions than the message. Of course, he was not taking away the importance assigned to studying the messages. That was the hallmark of media scholarship before him. But what he was talking about, or what he was trying to draw our attention as the fundamental nature of the medium. He says media, any media, shapes our perceptual environment. We have five senses, and it is through the five senses we make meaning out of our external world. But what if the senses itself, the scale of the sensory perception itself changes? And as I always maintain, a change in the scale is not a simple change. It's a profound change. We often hear in academics that whenever we try and bring about something, we say this is a change. People say, no, this is not such a great change, because what is the change? This has been happening in the past. And it may be true at times that, we rarely come across something which is an enormously and completely new. What we do is, or what we often come across as under the name of change, is mostly a change in the scale. And I think the change in the scale, which I will try and prove later, is a phenomenal change that would really cascade into multitude of changes in the other fields. And taking that into account, McLuhan was saying that when we get telescope, our visual perception changes. When we get newspaper, when we begin to write, when the language gets language acquires a new medium of script, the whole linguistic experience and linguistic learning through the language changes. When the written word is more when it changes from writing in manuscript form to printing books, it's a change in the scale. But according to Marshall McLuhan, as we moved from a handwritten world uh, of books to a printed world of books and literature, he said the whole new set of ideas and realities came about in the 300, 400 years post 1450, when we had the first printing press by Johann Gutenberg. In fact, he goes as long as attributing the rise of nation state, rise of modern universities, rise of modern law. In fact, the whole idea of modernity, Marshall McLuhan would perhaps, with some exaggeration, of course, could link it to the rise of book as such. So change in the medium. We had literature before book, but when the printing press came about and the scale of production, distribution, uh, and consumption and access changed, the whole literary word changed, and of course, not just literary word, the entire world, what we can broadly call as the modern world, changed. It brought about what we can broadly say as modernity. So, so it's quite important to realize that both Marx and McLuhan, Marx in more in political economic terms, and McLuhan more specifically in terms of medium, are talking about something of fundamental importance, and that is that the environment within which production activity, be it an economic production or literary production, the environment under which production activity takes place, not just production, but production, distribution, consumption, reception, access. There's a whole chain of things. You produce, you distribute, you receive, you access, you consume, and when the material conditions change, as Marx says, or as Marshall McLuhan says, when the environment changes, okay, then all these activities are bound to get changed. And therefore, we are going to witness something new. So, borrowing these two fundamental ideas, one from Marx and one from Marshall McLuhan, I'm here to argue that we need to focus on change in the literature, and fundamental change perhaps is ensuing because the material conditions of our literary activity have changed, if are changing, if not already changed. So, and it's not simply a social theory per se. It is not simply a political theory. Even, if you go to, the neurosciences, if you go to the cognitive sciences, they begin to argue that the material conditions, once it's changed, it also brings about, new neural pathways in our cognitive abilities. The material conditions around us create new neural pathways. Or the hardworking, or sorry, the hardwiring in the brain changes, perhaps may not be evolutionary change per se, which would pass on from one generation to another. I mean, it may not be as compulsive and as expansive change as an evolutionary change, but as an individual, uh, individual experiences a new world because the material conditions changes even the cognitive reception of individuals. Neural pathways changes, the the unused connections of the previous connections of or previous slowly are pushed into non-use or non-functional. New ones are created which allowed us to exploit the tools, and when a neural pathway changes, it's going to create a new cognitive environment. From new cognitive environment, we shape a new cultural environment as such. In fact, Marshall McLuhan goes on talking about three types of people. First, before the script arrived, there was something called as an oral culture, where there is no medium, no external medium, there's no external dominant medium. All we understand is through primarily our experiences, senses, and therefore he calls that kind of a culture as the tribal culture. What is, or what we call as an oral culture. Oral culture, the sensitivity that we have is that of a tribal sensitivity. Please do not misunderstand the word tribal here. I'm not talking about tribal in the very strict and a very normal sense of the word tribal. Tribal is anyone who does not have an access to an externalization of thought. That means there's no medium outside the body. Everything is embodied. All our communication, all our memory, all our thinking is essentially embodied. There's no external medium to store, distribute, produce, access as such. But then, as I said, with script, when language acquires script, as Marshall McLuhan says, something fundamentally changes. And he says that this new change with the script, first the arrival of script to the language, and then later a more scale change in the terms of printing, mechanical printing. He says it brought a new world, a new sensitivity, a new epoch or era called as a literary era. In fact, he says that from tribal man or tribal human, the whole sensitivity changed and we created a literary human. And post 1450, we created typological human. And the third, then he says that from 1840 to almost 1940, again the media environment changed in a big way, with lots of electrical media coming into being, first from telegram to then photo to telegraph and telephone and television and cinema, and then of course to some extent computers in the initial stage. And all this electric media from almost, let's say, 1840 to 1940 or 1950, Marshall McLuhan said, we created a new man, which he says is retribalized. It's a retribalization of a man. That means the tribal sensitivities, the oral culture, the mysticism of the oral culture, the communal experience of the oral culture got reinvented, reestablished, albeit in a different way, with the help of the media. And he goes on talking about, in fact, this could also be a very interesting area to talk about, but this is at least not my project at the moment, because we are going to now get into some more specific aspect of literature. But that's something that's very interesting that's happening. So according to Marshall McLuhan, three very important eras could be identified in overall human evolution based on the canon of analysis of medium or the media environment around the human beings. And that is, of course, as I said, the literary, the tribal culture or the oral culture. From there, we shift to the literary culture and the typographical man or typographical culture. And from there, from 1840 onwards, or let's say late 19th century and 20th century, we are moving into what is called as retribalized version. And then, as I would like to show in a limited way later on, that what is happening to us, okay, are we becoming a new man, a new human being culturally? And the answer to that is yes, particularly, as I said a little while ago, that particularly post 1980s, or let's say post 1990s, in the last 3 decades or so, in particular, or last 5 decades in general, we are slowly, gradually, but definitively being transformed into a new kind of being, new kind of human being. Following Marshall McLuhan's idea, I would say we are becoming a kind of a new nomad. If the 19th century and the early 20th century transformed us from being a literary person to a retribalized person, the last 30, 40 years are transforming us into a new nomad person. And what do I mean by new nomad? And what connection the new nomad has with literature is something that I will touch upon towards the end of it. So my point, the second point is, or rather the first point is that why should we be caring about the digital in the field of literature? Because it's a profound change. It's not simply a small change. It's not like, just a small addition or small increment here and there. It's a change of a scalar type. Okay, right. So that's my first point. The second point is, if that be the case, then rather than talking about small changes here and there, let's look at the characteristics of the change. Or is there any particular direction in which these changes are taking us to? Of course, several people have worked on this. I will try and give a quick summary of, a lot of different array of theories and observations and experiences. I'm not saying that the direction or the overall contours of these changes are limited only to what I'm going to discuss this with you, but these are probably the broad changes which are more relevant for our current topic. And one very important change as we digitize, I've written in the digital era, it means there are some, when do we call something as an era or epoch? When structures change fundamentally, when the overall environmental conditions change fundamentally, we say, yes, there is a structural, an epochal change. So if that be the logic, if that be the criteria, then we need to, or I need to answer that what are such structural changes that we see as we digitize? There can be several, as I said, but I will bring three or four which have more direct connection with the literature, field of literature. First is we're increasingly accessing not just literature, but all forms of communication from a new ground. It's not an embodied ground, it's not a face to face ground, it's not the ground of the paper, but it's a screen. Our life is getting increasingly screen centric. Trust me, this is far more fundamental and deeper than what meets the eye, literally. Okay, when we are communicating more and more through screen, and just look at this. Had there not been corona, I'm sure we would have perhaps met face to face, where there would have been many more clues for you to read me, learn and understand me, and I had much more clues to know and understand you as audiences than this, you know glowing screen in front of me is allowing me. In fact, I am at disadvantage. You know, I can't see any of you. I see only names or abbreviations. I see more of an abstractions that your personalities are being, I mean, you've been represented uh, by abstractions of your title and S and D and B and C, or the photos that you have chosen to put up, than what you actually are as an audience. Okay, you have at least some visual clue about me, but I have very little clue about you. So it's a completely different ball game. When we turn into screen, it gives us enormous control of what and how things could go around. So screen centricism is a fundamental change, a cultural change. So I mean, just look at this from look at our reading. I mean, if we say reading is fundamental to literature, okay, the overall literary field rests on one important aspect, reading. And till now, I mean, till the last 30, 40 years, reading was primarily on paper or on tablets, not the computer tablets, but the tablets of the original kind. Okay, so the reading was primarily on paper or tablets or some other physical embodied medium. Today, which could be carried and so on. Today, most of our reading has shifted to screens. In fact, that's a very, very important change, structural change that has taken place in the field of literature. So right from a very small or trivial Facebook post to very deep, big, huge novel, our reading has shifted from on screen of television, on screen of laptops and computers and television, and of course to Kindles. We are increasingly reading books not in the form of hardbound paperback editions, but we're reading it on Kindles, where we simply press a button and the new book would come, rather than going to library and undertaking a physical act and picking it up and then flipping through the pages and putting some bookmarks and so on. All the embodied aspect of reading has been getting increasingly transformed into a screen centric activity. And trust me, it's not a simple change, and I'll try and show how it is not a little later. Equally important, another change which has a direct and a very, very serious implication to literary work is increasing visualization of whatever we communicate. And in fact, this is perhaps the core at which literary word is getting shaped by increasing visualization. uh, you know I mean, just look at your experience of the laptop or the mobile that is in front of you, and you are increasingly you are dealing with it, through the visuals. I mean, you can just go through, your daily dose of WhatsApp, daily dose of Facebook, and just reflect on how much video or how much visual you have consumed over the text, the language based text. And I'm sure you would realize that without perhaps you becoming very consciously aware of it, the visuals and the videos and the audios are occupying two-thirds, perhaps more than two-thirds of your time and attention, which was earlier given to the text. So there's an increasing visualization, and you could see this being getting reflected into, uh, emergence of something new. We already had comics, which was, of course, a form of storytelling, based heavily on the pictures and the visuals. Okay, but we now have much more than the comics, which we have graphic novels. So, increasingly people are writing in terms of graphic novels, from graphic novels to film adaptation. Okay, to, everything now. Increasingly storytelling is becoming, getting into the video form. So visualization uh, hits at the core of what we had understood so far of, of literature. In fact, if I can say so, and please correct me if I'm wrong in my observation, if I can say so, that I have observed this across at least various departments, English departments in India and across the world, where the English language departments are increasingly becoming the departments of film studies. I mean, this is where I, as a student of media, has slight discomfort, where I would say, film studies is our legitimate area, and how is it that the English language departments are getting into film studies? I've seen many, including my department, including the English department at my own university, and of course several other. We have lots of wonderful scholarship about film theories and so on, coming from people who have actually earlier done literature. In fact, my area of thesis was in film studies. Okay, sort of. I research on the film songs, and while I was studying that, I found lots of wonderful theorists and critiques in this field, in the field of films. And when I checked up their basic credentials, I realized that many of them were actually from literature, field of literature. So it may be somewhere realization, maybe an intuitive one, a not very formalized one, but it may be a case that we now realize that more and more literature is either coming in the form of audiovisual, or the old literature getting transformed in the form of audiovisual, and therefore we need to slightly get out of those rigid ideas of literature being simply and literally related to literals. It could also be audio and visual. In fact, today, if you if you ask youngsters, they will tell you that they do not anymore read the books as such, but they listen to the books. I have my Audible. I have on my you know Spotify several interesting, particularly Audible. I have read lots of literary work on Audible. It is not read, actually heard. So there is an increasing transformation of the literary world into A, audio, and B, visual. So there is increasing visualization, which I think is is a fundamental change. Words are sharing increasing space with the visuals and audio. The third aspect is that of, it's a whole array of things called, from conversation, interactivity to links and hyperlinks. Reading a book, many people say, what's the difference between reading a book on in a hard copy and on a Kindle, or let's say for on internet? What's the difference? I mean, it's the same. The only thing is that the medium has changed, and so there's hardly a difference, many people say. But I say, no, it's not like that. When you read it on Kindle, when you read it on internet, it's not a very linear reading. The reading is always supported by an environment which encourages you to take up the links and the hyperlinks In a way, it's not a very linear reading from page one to the last page that you generally go through when you read a hard copy. Of course, there is also a distraction when you read a hard copy, but it's a distraction not coming from the medium itself, but coming from the environment. But when you read a book on Kindle or on some other internet site, okay, the distraction, or if not called as distraction, but some kind of an alternative comes from the medium itself. It is a part of the structure of the medium to offer you links and hyperlinks and sublinks. In fact, I converted my thesis into, of course, I submitted as a part of the university mandate. I submitted as a proper written copy, but I've converted into audiobook. So when I read the abstractions of my thesis, I can always have a less abstract version of the same in the form of some song or some film scene. So in the same medium of a PDF file or the same medium of electronic file gives me a book-like experience, and just a click away is waiting a more audio-visual experience. So it's not a linear reading. And when linearity is changed, remember, the whole literary word would change. So the ability to converse, interact, links and hyperlinks. And links and hyperlinks give you the ability to interact with the content. And then sometime you can also actually interact with people who are sharing. For example, when you read a Kindle or some other books like this, you also come to know about who all in the world are reading the same book at the same time or in the past. And you can actually join the group and share your experiences, a facility which was so rare to have in the printed word. Of course, you had book clubs and all that, but then it was not so easy for a reader to get in touch with those people. But it is just a click away. It's just a small conversation away when you read it on Kindle or other things. So it's a fundamental change in the reading environment. Then another aspect of digital world, which may have not such a direct effect, but it could have potentially on the larger reception environment, is the informatization or datafication of our reading process. When we read something on internet, on the new digital devices, we are actually living a digital footprints. And if they are read, and they are often read by some third party based on AI and various algorithms, remember, you get, and I'm sure you all know this, when you read something on Kindle, when you read something on any of the digital platforms, you often get, when you read, watch or listen on any of the digital platforms, you often get some kind of recommendations. They're all suggested to you by an algorithm, a technological algorithm supported by a corporate or commercial interests. And this is quite different than the kind of algorithms that we used to be exposed to in the non-digital era. Of course, we used to get recommendations from our friends, our well-wishers, elders, teachers, and so on. Or we used to, enjoy the beauty of randomness. But with algorithms, that randomness perhaps is minimized. I'm not saying that it has gone altogether. It can, but we could increasingly get into, as many people have pointed out in different contexts, but I would extend that to the context of literature as well. It's quite possible that our literary reading henceforth, which would be dominated by the data and datafication of our reading habits, digital reading habits, it would be shaped more by the algorithms, technological algorithms and corporate interests than perhaps the social networks. I'm talking about social networks of the pre-digital era, the real social networks and randomness. So these are some of the important aspects of the digital era, which have a direct implication to the world of literature. And there's one last, which I'll quickly talk about, is the miniaturization. So from miniaturization to complete disembodiment. So we are moving from material existence of books and literary work, okay, and which we could actually own. In fact, there's a pride in owning books. and you must have often seen, and I have resisted this temptation very cautiously, to use the bookshelf as my background, the Google background. I have consciously resisted the temptation, but often you would see that people whenever they want to be shown against some backdrop, often the wise people, the learned people, the educated people, the elite people, the highbrow people would perhaps like to be filmed, to be imaged against the, or photographed against the backdrop of a bookshelf, right? And how often you see it on television interviews, how often you see it in our other formal encounters. This is the legacy of the literate word that we are carrying. So we used to have a pride in owning the book, the hard copy of the book. And I'm sure many of us who are born before 90s, or who are born perhaps in the 70s and 80s, would still take a great pride in in decorating our homes and cabins, okay, with a lot of books. Half of them have not been read, but there is a sheer pleasure of owning the material, material form of a book. Now, howsoever material books that I may have on my Kindle, I may have something like 50 books, 100 books. The pleasure of showing them, the sheer sensory pleasure of the basic pleasure of owning the material aspect, is not there as such. In fact, Walter Benjamin has a very interesting take on that. He says that, we have a very basic relationship with the material existence. So ownership, we love to own. Um, According to Walter Benjamin, who is very, very important scholar. In fact, in case if you have not read already, I would strongly suggest that you may please read one of his, seminal works, where he says that art in the age of mechanical production. Okay, I'm sure had he been alive to see this day, he would have definitely said this. He would have definitely written the sequel of his book, Art in the Age of Digital Production. Okay, so he says, and I quote, ownership is the most intimate relationship that one can have with the object. Okay, not that they come alive with the owner, but the owner lives with them. Okay, so that's a very important thing. Now, what happens with miniaturization, as we see in Kindle, or what happens with complete disembodiment? So what actually happens when Kindle sends you a book, let's say War and Peace, and if you buy a War and Peace hard copy, it's quite thick book. If you buy a Mahabharat copy, of any version, okay, I'm sure it would run into something like 300, 400 pages minimum. So getting that copy, okay, the hard copy, and getting an email, downloading some bytes of War and Pieces on your Kindle, these are two fundamentally different experiences, and of course two different uh, environment. So miniaturization to embodiment, that means from material existence to ownership, to privilege. So we are only getting a privilege access, but we do not own it, because there is nothing to own about. So I think these 4 or 5 fundamental changes in the digital spaces have profound impact. They profoundly shape our literary world as well. So having described this, let me turn to the third point in this particular lecture, and that is, what do you mean by literature structurally? Of course, please, now here is, I'm entering into a difficult terrain for me. I'm not, as I said, I'm not a person from literature background, so my reading and my observations are mostly, perhaps you may find it a little superficial, but let me do that. So in my assessment, literature is fundamentally about imagination. It is a world of imagination. It may be an imagination of the fantasy type, or it may be an imagination of the normative type or a utopian type. Okay, but it is precisely a world of imagination. It's a wish fulfillment dream. or it could be a dream of the anxiety, it could be a nightmare, but it is surely a terrain of imagination. Okay, and if I were to quote Plato, uh, Plato says, and I quote, he says, "Art is a dream of an awakened mind, a work of imagination, withdrawn from the ordinary life, dominated by the same forces that dominate the dream, and yet gives us a perception and dimension on reality that we won't get from any other approach to the reality." Unquote. I mean, whatever the philosophical implication of the statement, it clearly underlines the imagined aspect of it. Now, when we deal with this, and when we try and take this to the world of digital era, I'm sure if you look at the visualization and the increasing technological facilities that we have, the technological facilities are helping us to create an immensely different, uh, you know, it is giving us an access to an imagination which is completely unknown of. Just look at the special effects. I'm sure many of you must have watched extra ET and Gravity films like ET, Gravity, or Inception, and so on, so forth, or for that matter, our Indian Bahubali, and so on. I mean, whichever genre of films that you must have watched, I'm sure it has given you an imagination of a completely unprecedented type. But remember, it's an imagination helped primarily by the technological means. It's an imagination of the visual type and not so of the imagination of the abstraction type, which literature of the traditional type is so fundamental to produce, so important to produce. As they say, I in one of the interviews that I had given, I was asked this question, and the person said that, don't you think that you know uh, a visual is worth thousands of words? I say yes, it is. A visual is worth thousands of words. But I say, but there is also converse, and that is a word can create thousands of images. So it's not just a one-way traffic; it's a traffic from both ways. A word can also create thousands of images. If I say in India, okay, I'm sure all the 40 odd people who are there in this meeting would have, some, you know, hundreds and thousands of images of the word India. So it's not simply the thing. So literature's great potential, the literature of the earlier type, the literature in the language type, okay, the written type, the text-oriented literature had this fantastic ability to create an imagination which was dependent on you and you only. You interact with the word, you interact with the language in a linear way, and you go on creating the images as you like. Now here, when we replace this imagination that literature is often credited to create, and it's a fantastic imagination, okay, it is getting into place when literature, where the storytelling gets more and more converted into audio and visual, it becomes increasingly very, very intensive, overpowering, but it leaves you as the reader, and I'm using the word reader in a semiotic way. Reader means anyone who makes sense, not simply anyone who reads. So, as a reader, you have very little space for imagination. You have to borrow. You are swept away by the imagination of the director. I would often compare this with a metaphor. So, what's the difference between reading a metaphor, reading a novel in the form of a book, listening the novel in the form of an audio file, and watching the same novel getting converted into a film? Let's say Devdas. Okay, so reading Devdas the novel, listening Devdas an audio file, and watching Devdas the film. Forget about the aesthetic treatment and so on. But cognitively, I consider these three as different experiences, and I'll try and compare this with. I'll try and explain this with a metaphor. It's like It's like, you imagine a mother and a child walking. So there are three possibilities. Possibility number one, that the child is walking separately, okay, but he is surely within the physical reach of a mother, physical sight of the mother. That's possibility number one. Possibility number two is that mother is holding the hand of the child. So the child has some flexibility to move around, but that's just some flexibility. And then the third possibility is that the mother has lifted the child, and as they say, godi mein lega. So the mother is walking with the child, by holding him in her arms. There are three ways, and the three experiences are different. So when mother is holding the child in her arms and walking alone, the child is not walking. Child is still able to see the world around, but primarily in a constrained way. It's surely not a entirely embodied experience of learning and understanding the world as such. I think watching film is like, the director is actually taking you in his or her arm and showing you the world. You are overpowered. It's easy. You love getting overwhelmed. It's comforting, but it's not your imagination, perhaps. Or you have less space for imagination. Rather than saying no imagination, I say you have less. Reading an audiobook or listening to an audiobook is like you're holding the hand of a mother, okay, and you're walking around, where you have limited ability. You can still imagine how the protagonist would look like and so on. But still, it's been constrained by the character of the audio and the reader and so on. And when you actually read it through the books, you're completely on your own. You're still within the gaze of the writer, the author. You're still directed by the author, but you can create an imagined space of your own. It's like walking, a child is walking while being in the sight of the mother, but still free. So if literature is an imaginative experience, then what would happen if we move more and more to visual experience of literature, when we move more and more to the audio experience? I think we would be perhaps moving into a different realm of imagination, much, much different than the imagination which was entirely dependent on us. It is a techno cultural imagination that we would be moving into, rather than the cultural, personal, cognitive imagination that we would have had that had been given to us by the literary work. Then let's move to the other aspect of literary experience, and that is uh, what happens when we read literature today, or what is actually the requirement of reading literature. Literature demands two very, very important things. One, in my assessment, the formal idea of literature requires two fundamental things from the reader. One, a solitude, and two, concentration. The two aspects, solitude and concentration. Now, these are precisely the two things which are being taken away by the digital world. In fact, if I can slightly quickly share, which I'm sure you would have seen this, but if I can quickly share a very small thing. Okay, I'll quickly share a logo. Okay, which is, I'm sorry, just give me a minute. I'll quickly share. I hope you have seen the Kindle's logo. Okay. Can you see this logo? I do not know if you can see this logo.
Not yet, sir.
Okay. Anyway, there's some problem. Okay. Nothing great about this. I hope you all can see this logo. I'll just zoom it.
Yes, sir.
Right. Now, there's hardly anything here if you see it that way. Um, that's the only thing that I will show you visually. Okay, I'll stop sharing this. Okay, now it's a very, I mean, I would say it's irony that of sort that Kindle has a logo like this, where Kindle has actually gone to, the Kindle's logo is based on the time or the culture of reading, which Kindle structurally plans to destroy. Okay, and what does the logo indicate? It indicates the same thing: concentration and loneliness. I mean, not loneliness, solitude. Sorry, not loneliness, solitude. The human figure in the Kindle's logo is cut from everything. All people, city is there in the company of nature. Perfect solitude. He's all alone in the company of the nature and focusing without getting distracted, focusing on reading, right? So maybe Kindle would like to, bring it back to the Kindle experience, but that they can only hope for, which perhaps may not be the reality. Reading Kindle, book on Kindle, may still not be an entirely a solitary experience, because Kindle still provides you lots of abilities to connect, and it surely may not be encouraging a completely concentrated reading, because it may still give you links and hyperlinks and Wikipedia entries, and perhaps at times some other links as well. But if you look at that way, solitude and concentration were the fundamental requirements of a very solid literary experience. Particularly, literature demands solitary and concentrated, experience with concentration. As they say in Marathi, I often have come across many of my friends who would say, friends of my age or perhaps elder than me, who would say, पुस्तक घेतलं आणि एका बैठकीत वाचून काढलं. Okay, broadly translated in English, it would mean I got the book and read it in one sitting. So to read it in one sitting means, and that is supposed to be, the more privileged, the more prestigious, and the more aspirational experience of reading, that you read the book in just one go, one sitting. And writers used to write that way. So, for example, imagine reading Mahabharat in the contemporary times. I mean, the kind of, or for that matter, War and Peace. I mean, even if you don't want to go to as ancient, you know, thing like Mahabharat, War and Peace. I mean, you require a lot of time and a lot of concentration to go through the entire space created by War and Peace and Mahabharata and Ramayana, or for that matter, even if you read Marathi, novels like Tumbarche Khot, or some big novels, or say for example even the latest one. As I said, it took some time for me, almost, let's say, 20 days of concentrated reading, when I could finish the novel by a novel, Hindu Ek Jagnache Samruddha Adga in Marathi. It's a thick novel. You have to go through, the whole range of characters and understand and imagine them, and it requires a significant investment in terms of the solitude and a concentration. Now, in this context, my question is: does the digital environment allows you this solitude and this concentration? Forget about reading literature. And I'm sure your own experience in the last couple of years must have told you often. You may not have actually shared it with anyone per se, proactively and openly, but deep down we all know that it is becoming increasingly difficult for us to concentrate on things. We often complain about our students, and that's true, that our students have very, very less, attention span. And one of the reasons why the attention span is getting increasingly fragmented, okay, it's not simply it is coming down, it's getting fragmented. And I'll talk about that a little later. The attention span has come down. I mean, in one sitting, you can't focus on something for more than, let's say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes. In fact, as adults, we are becoming childs. Digital era is making us children once again. As we know, children have very small attention span. In fact, we've been taught that one of the aspects of growing up is to control our attention. One of the problems with children is children's are very weak on holding their attention. Well, the problem with the problem with childhood is that children generally, I'm of course not a psychologist, surely not a child specialist, but children are perhaps more uncomfortable with solitude. So what we are actually becoming in the digital era, we are increasingly becoming children. So it's not literally that we are children of the digital era. We are actually becoming children if we were to look at the solitude and the concentration aspect. Fragmented concentration and scarcity of solitude. I increasingly come across, and I'm sure many of you would confirm with my observation. I increasingly come across students who say, I mean, after 15, 20 minutes, or if there are no gadgets around, there are no visuals around, they'll say, sir, feeling bored. And it's not just students. If you mingle with, uh, individuals in the age group of, let's say, 12, 13 to 20, 25, who have spent their most of the formative years post 1990s, or the millennials, if you mingle with them, you would realize that they become increasingly restless, uncomforted if there is no distraction around them. It's very difficult for them to be just with them. And it's not simply the problem with one or two individuals that we perhaps know, but it's more or less a generational problem. And why only blame the younger generation? It is becoming increasingly difficult for us also. I mean, I would confess myself that I also suffer partially from this disease of, I mean, I can still manage with solitude, but the ability to concentrate, particularly when the screen is around, that ability is diminishing fast. Literature demands this. I mean, even if you take a poem of few lines, or if you take a novel of several thousand lines, okay, we see that they require a great deal of inner concentration. But that's not happening. In fact, there's a contrast. If I can bring this contrast, increasingly the algorithms that run the digital world are becoming of several thousand lines. If I can say so, when you use Amazon or Facebook, if you look at the basic algorithm, the what we call it as the protocols or the algorithms, okay, that is written in whatever language, digital language, okay, that may run into crores of lines. So while the algorithms are becoming increasingly heavy in terms of their text, in terms of their lines, the literary experience, the narrative experience is increasingly becoming smaller and smaller. In fact, there's a site, there's a new genre in the digital narrative called as TTT. And what is that TTT? Terribly tiny tells. Okay, one of my students did a research on that. Terribly tiny tells. So while the literature is shrinking because of the lack of attention of whatever structural reasons, while the algorithms are expanding, literature is shrinking. I'm not too sure if we would come across in the digital version, in the digital era, maybe a couple of years from now, I'm not too sure if we may still be having many books of the length and the size and the intensity of the War and Peace in Mahabharata. We may have intense engagement with smaller narrative experiences than a general engagement with intense novel experiences. So there is a shift as such. So this is another important aspect, a change in this. So we would be a literary word will have to increasingly face the challenge of the solitude, lack of solitude, and lack of concentration. Okay, and there's a very interesting book that was written called. I mean, literature people would like to call this as an experience of shallowness. In fact, there's a book called The Shallow by Nicholas Carr, written somewhere around I think 1989 or somewhere around. I don't remember exactly, but where he Nicholas Carr says that the net, the internet, it seizes your attention, and it seizes your attention through screens, through movements, through the visual, through the glaze and the gloss of the screen and the movements on the screen. It seizes your attention, but then it fragments it and distributes it to thousands of people around, thousands of sites around. I'm not too sure if when you open an internet, how many windows you create. I can tell you that at the moment on my screen of my laptop, there are 7 windows on my internet and 3 windows of my software programs open simultaneously. So there are at least, besides this screen of Google Meet, there are at least 9 odd windows trying to catch my attention. And had this not been my formal lecture here, I would have constantly moved from one tab to the other, one window to the other. The same experience on Facebook, the same experience on internet. This is surely not the literary experience that we know in the last 400 years. Or why only 400 years? I would say this was not surely the literary experience, even from the oral culture. In fact, far more. In the oral culture, the listener would have to give a lot more attention to the speaker. A lot more attention to the speaker. In fact, Dhaneshwar in his Dhaneshwari says, Ata avadhana deje. This is in Marathi. In English, if it is loosely translated, it would means, please give me the innermost attention. And Dhaneshwar promises that if you give me innermost attention, I'll show you the form of the formless. Arupachi rupa dakavina, indriya karvi. I'll show you the form of the formless through your senses. So literature always demanded an avadhan, a deep attention. The digital era is going to take away the deep attention as such. Forget about deep attention, it would be increasingly difficult to give attention per se. In fact, as many people say, that we are living increasingly in an attention-seeking economy. The economy is not of the word and the content. It's the economy of seeking attention. So in that way, if literature has to confront, it will have to confront with the human attention of a different scale, okay? A scale which is enormous, multidimensional, right? After saying this, I'll come to last but one point, and that is, uh, of course, literature is an experience of the imagination, but literature is also an aesthetic experience. Again, I am entering into realm where I'm not an expert. In fact, I am only a novice, or perhaps even a fool. But let me do that. I love to be exposed. So, literature to me is essentially an aesthetic experience. And of course, you are much more trained in understanding and knowing what we mean by aesthetics, what are aesthetic criteria, how do we apply them, what are the fundamental aspects of the aesthetics, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you may be knowing about it. But in my assessment, the whole literary or whole aesthetic aspect, as I said, I'm putting this as an observation, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the entire edifice or the entire structure of aesthetic, in my assessment, in my observation, was based on two important cardinal principles. One, scarcity, of material and the immortality of the work. I'm not too sure how to actually argue this. It's an intuitive thought, perhaps, or it's a thought which I perhaps may not have better words to explain or argue, but think over. I think literature was, the aesthetics is being increased, is deeply shaped by the idea of scarcity. In fact, the same shallow Nicholas Carr quotes, uh, you know, uh, an opinion of a well-read person, but a new person of the digital era, okay, on the Russian classics. And I got this quotation here, very interesting quotation. And he says, and I quote, it's not Nicholas Carr who is saying, but it is someone who Nicholas Carr, interviewed, was a good person, otherwise an educated person. And he said, and I quote, "No one reads War and Peace. It is too long and not so interesting. And the fascination that it held for previous generation was just a side effect of living in an environment of impoverished access." Very unquote. So what this man was talking about, as the previous, I mean, he may be talking about certain novel, bigger in size, but what he's actually talking about in a deep sense is an aesthetic criteria. A criteria perhaps emerge out of an environment of impoverished access. Or if I can replace this word, if I can substitute this by the word called scarcity. So when the content, the text, the stories were limited in access, we developed an aesthetic criteria in that environment by which we evaluate the aesthetic worth of literary works. The other aspect is, and we often say this, that how immortal, how long lasting, if not immortal, how long lasting that piece of literature would be. So the piece of literature or the work of literature has to sustain generations. In that way, metaphorically become immortal. And then we say it's a great aesthetic work. And that's how we say Rama and Mahabharata in various forms have survived generations. So goes to Iliad and Greek, stories and mythologies, and other Shakespeare, great novelists and great literary figures. Their work has sustained and survived centuries and years, and that's why it gives us some aesthetic ground, some basic ground to judge its aesthetic worth, because it's long lasting. Or, to exaggerate slightly, it is almost immortal. We still assess, we still evaluate the aesthetic worth of many things based on several principles, but somewhere down the line, these two aspects, scarcity and immortality, are fundamental to the structure of our aesthetic criteria. Digital world, challenges both these. In the digital environment, uh, both the idea of scarcity, in fact, goes for a toss. There's no scarcity at all. In fact, if there is anything, it's only abundance. And though immortality is slightly different, but I would say, digital gives something, a sense of long lasting to any piece. In fact, just to give you a very, very personal experience, one of my students from journalism department recently, as a part of his project, created what is called as a podcast, and he interviewed me for that podcast. And then he began to market that podcast on various platforms, and I was very I got interested, in the sense that I like this thing, where he said that, and he said it in Marathi. He said, आजपासून तर जगाच्या अंतापर्यंत हे कधीही पॉडकास्ट तुम्ही ऐकू शकता. Literally translated freely, it would mean that you can listen to this podcast from the date today that I am releasing till the end of the world. It's a small podcast of a budding journalist, a student, okay, a small podcast of a small exercise, but he tries to seek some kind of an immortality to his work. I mean, it almost reminds me of Bhavuti's famous slope where he says, "Utpadyante mama kopi samana dharma, kaloya niravadi vipulacha prithvi." He says someone would definitely emerge who would be cohort and who would be able to appreciate my literary work. Why? Because time is infinite and the space is vast. Kaloya niravadi vipulacha prithvi. So the sense of immortality, apparent immortality, and lack of scarcity or the rise of abundance are changing in my assessment, or if not changing, they are posing fundamental challenge before our assumed canons of aesthetics or aesthetic analysis. In fact, sometimes I say what we require today is not the aesthetics of scarcity, but what we require today is aesthetics of abundance. What we require today is not the aesthetics of mortality or the immortality, but we not mortality, but what we require is the aesthetic, if at all there can be, of immortality. This is a very large philosophical question. I find myself to be very incompetent, though I can express this. But as I said, it's a very deep point where I may not have all the answers. And let me come to the last point of my presentation. How would the future literature be? Again, this is a very, very risky area, very risky area. And it's an area where I would be, exposing myself completely, and I'm sure I'm going to be proven completely wrong. Not just, I mean, I'll be in the next year, I may be proven wrong. The kind of changes, it's so difficult to predict. But I think it's important for people in sociology and humanities to predict. Even if the prediction goes completely for a toss, it's important to predict. Because by predicting what could happen in the future, okay, we may personally, individually, maybe, proving to be foolish, moral, perhaps. But our individual exposure may only add to a collective understanding that how things cannot be predicted, how they should not be predicted. So I predict this completely with the understanding that the prediction may be completely wrong in just a couple of years from now. So with this caveat, let me predict how the future literature would be. It's a little dystopian future that I predict, okay, for the traditional literature. One of the features of the dystopian literary era, seen from the contemporary point of view, would be the literature would be minimalistic. It would be more visual. It would be multi-track. It would be less authored. The sense of original authorship, a single author, a single work, would be very difficult to maintain. So multi-authored, multimedia, intensive, visual, and small, not long, but small, tiny. That is the literary era that we may be perhaps moving to. It's difficult for us to imagine, perhaps not so desired, going by the traditional understanding of literature that we all have carried, at least people of our generation have carried. But I think in days to come, we may have. I'm not eliminating the entire idea altogether that in future there would not be long novels. There would still be. Remember, though we are into the world of typesetting, we do not handwrite, but we still know how to write. We still occasionally may take pride in writing and doing some kind of calligraphy. But it would remain. The long novel, the earlier forms of literature may remain, the nostalgic memory, a preserved memory, a more cultivated memory of the future, but not the reality, the mainstream of the future. And let me end by bringing some good news for at least poets within the literary field. This is a very wild imagination, which I share with my students also. What kind of people would be important, let's say 50 years from now, 100 years from now, let's say 2121, 100 years from now, what kind of people would be important? And I would see that, I mean, quite unlike, quite unpredictable, quite surprisingly, I think 100 years from now, 50 years from now, two types of people would become very, very important who are extremely marginalized today. One is a historian. Historian today are highly marginalized. If you ask anyone where you would like to get after your 12th, I don't think many would say that I would like to become historian. They'll say I would like to become a medical practitioner, computer expert, and film director, and this and that. I don't think many people would say that they would like to become historian. To get an admission to history department may not perhaps today require too much of other percentage and other kinds of things. But I think 50 years, 70 years from now, history department would require the most brilliant minds. And the reason why I say so is because there is so much of abundance of data that to create some reasonable version of the history would require a brilliant mind to indulge. So history would require brilliant minds because there's just too much of the data that we are creating of our contemporary life for the posterity. So if someone in 2021 would like to make sense of what happened in 2020 on 16th of August, 16th of April to 2020, he will have to go through, a whole lot of things, right? There's just too much of data to make sense of. You require much more ability than the simply artificial intelligence and machine learning. So historians would be in demand. And the second category, which comes close to literature, is that I think in 2121, 100 years from now, poets would be in great demand. Or poetry would require brilliant minds. Because I think poetry would perhaps be the last domain to fall before the attack of AI generated content. Today, artificial intelligence can create almost, it's already creating many aspects of our, textual work. For example, what we speak can be immediately transliterated. One, from that, I know, being a journalist, I can tell you that we have now artificial intelligence and AI and machine learning, which can actually produce a feature of 500 words on its own. You give the topic, and it will create a feature of 500, 1000 words. You have in Sophia an interviewer. You have Alexa and Siri, who would do quite intelligent act as compared in today's standard. But I'm sure machine learning, AI, with lots of social media and lots of data available in the digital space, AI would increasingly become smarter and smarter, and they would inch forward to human endeavors like writing. Today they are writing journalistic stories, but just wait. You may still get AI writing in a short story or maybe a bigger story. And if we go by that, I think poetry would be the last bastion that would fall, if at all, if it falls, to the AI and the algorithms. Because poetry precisely is based on a very fuzzy, random logic, literary logic. It makes sense, and yet it's not logical. And therefore, I think in 100 years from now, perhaps brilliant mind would be reserved for poetry. So there is still good hope and good news for literature as well. This is very wild imagination, perhaps a foolish imagination. But if literature is to imagine, then howsoever foolish it may be at the moment, we need to. And that's why I thought I should end this speech on digital literature in the digital era on the note of an imaginative future for literature. Howsoever good or bad it may be, howsoever utopian or dystopian it may be, this is what I see. I'm sure I would be proven fool sooner than later. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful sharing these ideas with you. Thank you for having me, inviting me. I'm grateful to Drupadi ma'am, Manisha ma'am, the English department, and all of you who are here. Thank you so much. I'm open for any questions if there are. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you so much. Manisha, can we take some questions quickly?
Definitely will take some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure,
Thank you so much, sir,
Drupadi.
for a wonderful lecture. Manisha, can uh, anybody has questions for Professor Dhole?
I think there is some in the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah, I just read one small comment in the chat box. Mitali Shah said, feels something is missing if we don't have device for a short time even. Yeah, you're right. In fact, if you can see this, I know that for the next 1.5 at 5 o'clock, I knew that for the next 1.5 hour, I'll be with you as such. But still, I kept my mobile with me. Yeah, right. But yes, you're right, Manisha. Where I say sometime that all of us have become de facto Pavlov's dogs. If you remember the famous experiment by Russian psychologist Pavlov, where he says that we get conditions, we get conditioned, and these conditions produces our reflexes. So one of the modern digital era reflexes, if we find our mobile screen to be black like this because there's no activity, somehow we would quickly touch it to only see if there is some activity out there. So we are so becoming conditioned as such. So we don't want to be left alone as such, even for a short period of time. Thank you, Manisha. I agree with your observation.
Yes.
Um, any other questions? Shonali, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Dhole. It was very nice listening to your talk. It's more of a comment rather, not necessarily a question, and I would also like you to respond to this. So when you talked about the fact that now we don't really have those long fictions, right? Long novels, the way like War and Peace has been written. So I was trying to think of how the kind of novels that we have in the form of long novels have also changed with the proliferation of the digital age added to as well as computer graphics, for example, right? So if you think about books in the form of, let's say, Rowling's Harry Potter series, right? Or even Martin's Game of Thrones, like the Song of Ice and Fire and so on. So essentially, these are not the kind of novels that War and Peace is, but they are lengthened in terms of the kind of detailing, keeping in mind the fact that probably they are going to be transferred on screen, and the sort of cinematic nuances that are required to project the same would be available because of the digitization of reproducing certain kinds of scenes or sequences in a certain way. So probably the way long novels have been written earlier in the past with Tolstoy and so on have gone a certain kind of shift, but not necessarily in the same way. So that was more of what I wanted you to respond to.
I think it's a very interesting observation. Thank you so much for this observation. This is, in fact, I would respond to it this way. Your observation is well taken. I'll say that this is some kind of a mutation of our penchant or our likes for long form narratives. So earlier, long form narratives, be it a novel or Mahakavya, as they say, used to come as a form of one single package, right? One single package. Uh, but today, the package it doesn't come in one single package. It comes in the sequence of the packages. So it's not simply, there's of course corporate and commercial interests behind it, but if we discount that for the moment, and if you look at it only from the narrative perspective, today perhaps for whatever reasons, either of the writers end, at the writer's end or at the reader's end, okay, for whatever the environment that exists, the long form is now getting distributed across series and sequels and so on. And as you very rightly pointed out, the Harry Potter series, or the entire, the whole lot of series that come on Netflix and the Amazon Primes and so on, they are actually long form, okay, but given in smaller increments, in smaller installments. So we are moving from what we call it as an extensive experience or an expansive experience of literature to more episodic experience of literature. So from expansive to episodic. Now remember, I mean, it, at the end of it we may feel, I mean, it's simply an addition. So you say, fair enough, earlier we used to get it whole, now we get it in additions. But remember, addition, many times in organic systems, the reality is much more than the sum of its constituent parts. Okay, and usually these episodes comes after an interval. So it's not the original thought. I'm sure Harry Potter Part 1 and Harry Potter Part 9, or whichever. I don't know which was whether it was the 8th was the ninth or ninth was the ninth last. Okay, I think in between, and I think this entire writing process was spread over, let's say, 6-7 years or more than that. I'm sure J.K. Rowling must have got lots of inputs of reactions and feedback, informally, formally. Her publishers must have given as such. So even if we, in the hindsight, we may create, imagine Harry Potter to be a mega work, or so to say a Mahakavya in the Sanskrit tradition. Okay, but remember, it hasn't part of the single narrative thought. The narrative thought itself has gone into mutations, right? So it is a mutated long narrative rather than a singular long narrative. And these two are fundamentally different experiences. So yes, I agree with you that we may still not be completely doing away with the long narratives, but the long narratives would come in installments, in episodes, and we would perhaps be making a better sense of the long narrative much after the consumption of the last part. So it is now after reading, let's say 7, 8 things, then I may perhaps make a better sense of what Harry Potter the world was. Right? So maybe after reading 9 part, 1 year later, 2 year later, I may get the overall scheme of thought, if at all I can, rather than at the end of the last page of the book. Right? So I think this is in this way that the thing would change. I hope I haven't answered. I just respond.
And also how now we have an onslaught of a lot of fantasy narratives, because probably if, they are written with the point of view that they are going to be adapted on screen at some point. So there is a lot of detailing and other things that go into the writing process. Probably.
Absolutely. The thought that there has to be a visual dimension is so now getting ingrained into the writing psyche of the contemporary people. Okay, I often jokingly say this. And I've said this for my students as well, that when I was a young child, or when I was in 8th or 9th or whatever, my parent thought, now our child has come to age, if he can now write an essay. Okay, so if your son could write an essay, the parents would have thought and would have been felt very happy. Chalo yaar, bacha bada ho gaya, essay likh sakta hai, right? I think 10 years down the line, these, when these youngsters of who are 20, 21, 22, 25 now, when they would have their kids, they'll think, once their kid would produce a meme, they'll say, our child has now come of age, right? So what used to be writing an essay for us as a sign of coming of age, okay, could be, the ability to produce a meme would be a sign of coming of age. So there is, of course, there is a narrative. The narrative has been created, but not a monomedia narrative of language. It's language, text, in the typical sense, language, text, plus visual and video. And just look at it. No sooner something happens in our society, just 10 minutes later, and if you are there on Facebook, you would have memes. Phenomenal. And such mimetic things happening. I think memes, the idea of meme, I mean, there are two aspects: the intertextuality aspect, so producing from the previous text, the intertextuality aspect, and the multimodality aspect. These two are going to dominate the narrative structures of the digital era. It has to be mimetic and intertextual. I mean, it would not be entirely, but surely a lot of inter. I mean, I can't think of any new today. I mean, almost all the serials that would come on Netflix and Amazon, if they are in Hindi, they would invariably have some intertextual take on Bollywood films or some Indian context or something. You can't have any of these serials devoid of any reference, intertextual reference to Bollywood. If you look at Dam Laga Ke Haisha, a very interesting movie, starring I forgot. Um, the entire movie is completely intertextual. It is telling the story of 90s of Bollywood style into the Bollywood style of the 20s, 2000s. It's a phenomenal thing. So yes, the visual element, Shonali, as you said, is going to be very, very important. Writers in days to come, even they're writing in the text, they'll have to write in the visual form. I am reminded of the writing style of Shyam Manohar, a Marathi writer of great genius, one of the very, very important writers, perhaps not so popular. But if you read Shyam Manohar's short stories, or even long one, you would find Shyam Manohar almost, you would almost feel like, he has some kind of a camera, and he has put the camera, okay, and the camera is actually producing, rather than images, he is actually producing images through words. Such a visual style of writing, very captivating, very short, almost like quick camera cuts. If you read Shyam Manohar's book, phenomenal. It's a very, very interesting way. Quite different than the lengthy and big and bombastic literary style that we used to generally encounter in the Marathi literary circles. So that's how it is. Yeah. Uh, Usha Nair has one comment. For a language teacher, it's scary that students don't read, prefer to listen to audiobooks or watch a book adaptation as TV series. What will happen to the language learning? A lost generation of readers. Ma'am, I think you have put the finger right on the point. This is something that I often discuss among the gatherings of teachers, and Drupadi ma'am is a witness to that. Yeah, it's true. I understand that the ability to sustain prolonged linguistic language-based expression, ability to read has come down. Our children do not read. If at all they read, they would read only short things. Their overall reading has not come down. Surely their reading per se has not come down, but the kind of things that they read and the environment in which they read is surely different than the reading that we are accustomed to. They do read, but the reading is different. The reading is short, episodic. The reading is kaleidoscopic, not focused. The reading is collage oriented. Okay, the reading experience is is metaphorically very close to strolling on the road, where you are not focused on anything. You just consume whatever comes your way, right? So Facebook is a strolling experience. Okay, so the reading is less abstract. Their reading is more of audio and visual. What will happen to language learning? Yes, very much. There are two approaches to the teachers to respond to this. And I often discuss this in the gatherings of the teachers. There are two approaches. One, as they typically tell us, and there is an increasing pressure on all of us as teachers, to be there where the students are. There's an increasing pressure on us. They say if the students are there on the digital media, you should be there on the digital media. What are you doing here in classrooms? Teachers, please be there in the digital. If they are in the visual spaces, you go and be there in the visual spaces. And therefore, there is an increasing pressure on teachers to be like them, to be like our students, to use social media, to use audio, to use visual. There's an increasing pressure on all of us. I'm sure all of you would know this, and particularly in last 1 year, that there is an increasing pressure on all of us, particularly when we are using this mediated interfaces of Zoom and Meet and so on, to use PPT, PowerPoint presentation. We have to increasingly present than teach. There's an increasing pressure on us. That's the sense of that's one way. So if the students are like that, be like them. That's one approach. As they say in Marathi, की वासरांच्या कळपात घुसायचं असेल तर गायीने शिंग मोडून घ्यायची आणि वासरांच्या कळपात घुसायचं. Freely translated, it would mean that if you were to be like children, if you were to be in that community, you be like them. So you shed off some of your characteristics, typical characteristics, and be like them. But there is another way. And the other way is, no, you be what you are. Because the system in which you have come up, the language-based system, the linear system, the abstraction-oriented system, a system which demands concentration and solitude, a system which demands walking alone, not on the shoulders of your parents. It's a system that you and me have come up with. It's a system that you and me, when I say you and me, I'm assuming that many of you people who are present here are at least 60, 70 born. I mean 70 or 80 born, if not older. So we were born and brought up in that non-digital environment. Our formative years have gone in that. And therefore we are better, we are comfortable with language and abstractions of the language and solitude and concentration and so on. So the other approach which I insist and which I could say is that no, let's create an environment, let's put pressure on them, that please come to our grounds as well. I'm not here, I'm not asking this just because they want to be like us. They are not going to be like us, even if we would like them to be. They would invariably go on Facebook and Instas and Twitters. They would increasingly produce visuals and all that. But then if they are already on Facebook, whether or not we have taught them to be there, whether or not we wanted them to be there, if they are going to be there, it's important for us to give some examples, some experience for them of a non-Facebook, non-digital, non-visual world. A world of language, literary imagination. Can we give that? It's a tough task. It's like swimming against the tide. It's like going against the grain of the tide. But I think it is important. Let's not look at the student as villain of the story of language. If at all, if we look at from that perspective, if at all, students are victims and not the villains. So can we be a little more sympathetic for the students? And can we find some ways to bring them back to the joys of the language, the literature, the focus, the concentrated, the solitary, the abstract? In fact, one of the reasons why I didn't use any PPT today, I'm good at making PPTs. I in fact started making PPTs. And I was going to make a PPT. Yesterday, I told Drupadi ma'am that I may be using a PPT. And today I haven't. It's not that I didn't have time or inclination. I thought if I'm talking about literature and the language of that type, shouldn't I be only using language as my core tool of communication and not some PPTs? It may fail. It may not be impactful in the new environment. That's all right. But can I demand more attention? Can I demand more investment from my side as a speaker and from your side as a listener to engage with something which is slowly slipping out of our hands? And that's the reason why I changed my mind almost at the 11th hour and didn't use the PPT. I do not know how far I succeeded, but even if I fail, it's an attempt worth making with our students. And I often do that in my classrooms. People have problems with understanding language, but we expect people, we expect student to understand right away, right then. That doesn't happen. Even if they carry the confusion, I'm all right. But slowly the confusion would settle down. They will slowly get the name, the meaning of the word. Slowly they'll get used to the abstraction. And that's the reason I would suggest that let education be, at least education in humanities, be that last bastion where without hating digital, without hating visual, without making students villain, can we still hold on to the bastion of the traditional literature or traditional literary's intelligence? And I would say yes. So to your question, I would answer, ma'am, that yes, the situation is grim, but let's hold on to our ground of the literary intelligence.
Thank you, sir. I think we are running out of time, and we'll take this conversation again, take this up again, and I'm sure we'll get to hear you again at the department. Now,
Thank
I now invite Susan to propose the vote of thanks. Susan?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Dhole, for accepting our invitation and for conducting this very enlightening session for all of us present here today. Your lecture has given us a new direction of approaching culture and media studies. Thank you for bringing in different approaches for understanding this digital era that we are living in. Your session highlighted how the idea of text has transformed in the past few decades, with the act of reading itself undergoing a change. A heartfelt gratitude to you, sir. I would
thank you,
also
ma'am.
like to thank the department, especially Dr. Manisha Ghatge, head of the department, for organizing this memorial lecture for all of us. Thank you so much, ma'am. Also, thanks to Drupadi ma'am for coordinating this session. Lastly, I would like to thank and extend my gratitude to all the professors, research scholars, students, and ex students for being part of this session. Thank you, one and all. Today is also a very special day as it is Manisha ma'am's birthday, and I would
Oh,
like to wish her on behalf of all of us. Manisha ma'am, wishing you a very happy birthday, and thank you all for being present. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you,
evening
Susan.
ahead.
Thank you so
happy
much.
birthday, Manisha ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Manisha, can you close the session?
Yeah.
I invite Manisha, Dr. Khatke, to close the session.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Dhole, and I would like to thank all the alumni and the faculty of the department, retired faculty of the department being the part of this whole session, and our students who are doing the MA and PhD from the department. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate Drupadi's efforts to coordinate and arrange this program because we try to bring diversity in our university. So it is not only person from the literature we uh, prefer. So that gives us a different kind of a direction, and I'm really happy that the way you actually try to question, raise issues related to whether digital world is going to kill the literature or the interest of people reading literature. And also you give a lot of examples of graphic and other examples intertextuality, which is helping us to understand that how we can go beyond certain readings. Thank you so much for this. Thank you, Drupadi, for helping us and making things work well. Thank you so much, Dr. Dhole, and all the senior faculty from the department. It's always pleasure to be with them and get kind of a guidance from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
I
ma'am. Thank you so
yeah,
much.
thank you. We'll declare it's like the lecture is over.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. Drupadi, you have to
Thank you,
say. Yes,
everyone.
thank
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Manisha, especially Manisha, for making this possible. Thank you, everybody. Good night.